Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Anna, for the introduction. I don't think I have to persuade anyone here today about the reality of the culture war. We may differ over its means of its prosecution, but I doubt over its nature. Thus, we are also likely in agreement about the two sides in the culture war. There's one side that wants to preserve Western civilization and all its glories, a world with popes and parliaments, the rule of law, family life, and a rollicking good show. And the other side who wants nothing other than barbarous incivility, all of tyrants, despots, and HR departments. But I repeat myself. However, within the side that wishes to preserve Western civilization, I argue that there is an internecine disagreement of what ultimate victory should be. Although this division may not necessarily separate us here today, I think there are two major forces at present fighting to restore Western civilization, but we are fighting to restore two very different things. On the one hand, the larger and better organized of the two camps is the one that believes that culture will be won when classical liberalism is restored. I use the term classical liberalism so as to distinguish it from social liberalism, a distinction more common in the United States and the UK than in the UK and Australia. In the restorationist camps, there are people like James N. Buchanan, a Nobel Prize in economics, Ben Shapiro, an Orthodox Jew and political commentator, and Douglas Murray, a conservative author and agnostic, is also openly homosexual. The tent that wants to restore classical liberalism is very broad indeed. I would also probably throw in the IPA in Australia, perhaps the Cato Institute in the United States, that list as well. On the other side, there is a much smaller and less structured camp, both intellectually and politically, that wishes for a return to some kind of tradition. In this camp, there are people such as George Weigel, Cornelius Vermeulen, and Peter Kreeft. I'd probably add the Dawson Centre and certainly the Oriens Institute to that list. There are many other names that we can add to both lists. They are very far from complete or even adequate. My point is there is a very broad coalition forming that sees the West is under attack. It is comprised of those with religion and those with none, intellectuals and artists, political commentators, and politicians. I want to make 2 points. The first, thank God for such a coalition. Even with all our disagreement and divergent opinions, a robust debate between us will make our cause all the stronger. But the second point that needs to be made is that such a coalition cannot stand as it is, for there is no principle of unity that can hold such a coalition of urgent doctrines together. The debate must be had, but a winner must be declared. And it is my task here this afternoon to argue for what their victory should be. I want to argue for a very specific outcome, that culture, Western civilization, can only be restored when tradition is embraced. That the whole edifice of Western civilization rests not just on the thinkers and actors of culture, but rather on the religion that shaped their thoughts and actions. Western civilization can only be saved by the religion that founded it. That religion is Catholicism. And the kind of Catholicism is traditional Catholicism. For indeed, there be no other kind. In order to proceed, there are 3 things that need to be done. The first, I need to make the case that the West, insofar as it is a unitary cultural phenomenon, is a fruit of Catholic tradition. The second, I need to show that liberalism is neither the founding doctrine of Western civilization nor the rightful heir to the West's future. The third and final part, I'll need to show that it is only tradition that can restore the West, because it is Catholic tradition, largely, that created it. And since this is a simple talk and not a 12-tome magnus opus, I would have to give you just a smattering of thoughts on each topic. Now, even though I cannot give you everything you will need, I do hope to give you enough to continue the conversation. So what is the case? That the West is Catholic and that tradition is at its heart. Now, it's hard to make the case that the West is Catholic when, historically speaking, the evidence would suggest that the West was once Catholic, and even then, at best, was mostly Catholic, hardly entirely Catholic. History should teach Catholics to be at least gracious enough to acknowledge that we share the development of the West with our pagan forebears, our Protestant brethren, our Jewish cousins, and an ever-growing element of godless antagonists. After all, it was Protestant England that gave us the thinkers of liberalism and the explorers who took it to the farthest flung corners of the earth. The beginning of modern science, too, was a mixed affair. Leibniz and Kepler were Lutherans. Newton, Hooke and Boyle were Anglicans. And Haley, he was somebody religious. Many great thinkers were also not Catholic. Voltaire, Kant, Bacon, to name just but a few. Even in more contemporary times, the great discoverers in modern physics are Jewish. Born, Bohr, Feynman, Einstein. We must acknowledge the pre-Christian greats as well. Aristotle, Euclid, Cicero, and Homer. Now, certainly, we can start to list on the Catholic side some extraordinarily influential people. Copernicus, Mendel, and Galileo, again to name but a few. However, the case can be made that every Augustine and Aquinas, there seems to be a Plato, Homer, and Oppenheimer. But even if we line up all the great Catholic thinkers on one side of the ledger, and all the non-Catholic thinkers on the other, what would that prove? Even if there were a clear numerical winner, so what? Culture is not a numbers game, and the West was not created by statistics. In the same way, the Roman Empire was not overcome by materially superior force. A few ex-slaves, a number of on-the-margin characters, and a highly suspect group of Jews clung to the cult of a dead man who taught that the meek would inherit the earth. Hardly the stuff of a planned tactical incursion. Yet the West was forged, the Roman Empire was overcome, and the greatest civilization the world has ever seen came to be. But how? What is at the heart of Christianity that has allowed it to overcome the world? For the Jews, God's first people, even with the favoritism that God bestowed upon them, only hung on long enough to give us the Redeemer. What is it about Christianity that has allowed it to create something so unique as Western civilization? To say that Western Christianity is true is certainly the case, but that is not the answer, not entirely. For Judaism is true as well, but it did not take over the world. What is entirely unique about Christianity is that at its heart is a person, the person of Jesus Christ. Now, this might not sound like a significant intuition, even though a Catholic priest acknowledging this fact probably comes both as quite a relief and a genuine surprise. I'm not a Jesuit. But it hardly seems remarkable, and definitely not unique to Christianity. Muhammad is at the centre of Islam, the Buddha to Buddhism, and Guru Nanak to Sikhism. The difference, however, is that the central figure to those religions are not the end points of those religions. Muhammad is the prophet of Allah, the Buddha points to Dharma, and Sikhism is the message of Vaheguru. Even Moses was the best of Elohim. What is entirely unique about Christianity is that Christ is the religion. He is the centre of the religion he came to found. In Christianity, it is not strictly correct to say that Christ has a teaching, even though Christ teaches and is a teacher. Strictly speaking, Christ is the teaching. When Christ comes, he points to himself. Even though he is doing the will of the will of the Father is done when Christ reveals himself as the Alpha and the Omega. Only when he is lifted up, and he alone, will all men be drawn unto him. No one else makes such a claim. But what does any of this have to do with the creation and shaping of Western civilization? I think that most Christians are unaware of just what a radical departure the Christian religion is from the Judaism from which it was founded. The Old Testament gives a very detailed account of how Judaism was established. Within the theological and anthropological narratives contained in Torah, there are approximately 613 mitzvot, laws, that cover the entirety of a person's life. How a person should wash, eat, live, and marry. The law was halakha, the way to walk. What we see in the Jewish story is incredible intimacy between God and his people. The ritual washings are also lessons on hygiene. The dietary requirements are also teachings about your health and well-being. Far from diminishing the theological nature of these laws, for they are indeed intensely religious artifacts. They demonstrate the incredible intimacy between God and his chosen people. In Judaism, the law is the teacher, and the teaching is the Jewish way of life and its culture. If Judaism had no laws, it would have no culture, it would not even be a religion. Then Jesus steps into the great legal controversy of Second Temple Judaism and declares that there are two laws, a greatest law and a second one, much like it. On these two laws hang all the law and the prophets. This claim by Christ is no mere hermeneutic of interpretation or heuristic of practical religious observance. Christ is not streamlining the Old Testament for ease of use. This was a fundamental rewriting of the very fabric of religion itself. The rupture, however, was not in the abolition of law, but in its fulfillment. A new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you. But what is new in the new law was that Christ was the centre, not the law. And Christ the fulfillment of the law, its perfection and centre, its origin and consummation. But how are Christians meant to determine how Christ loved us, and how therefore they should love each other, when there were no detailed legal prescriptions about what this law would look like? How would a non-rule-based religion function? This was quite a problem that emerged right from the outset of the Apostolic Church. I think the Jewish authorities, and all their legal skirmishes with Jesus, perceived quite clearly that he was the inescapable conclusion that Christ's teaching was the founding of a new religion. Even Paul, when he falls foul of the authorities, is accused of something similar. This fellow persuades men to worship God, contrary to the law. As Christians, this fundamental difference can be lost on us, however. The problem faced by the Apostolic Church was solved actually by St. Paul, who taught that Christianity would not be a religion whose adherents would follow a list of prescriptions, but who would rather have to pattern themselves on the person of Christ. A Christian's life was not to observe a law, but rather to become like Christ. That is, to clothe ourselves in the habits of Christ. The Old Testament prophesies that when the Messiah came, the law would no longer be written in stone, but on the hearts of men. The heart in the Old Testament is a seat of understanding of the moral, spiritual, and intellectual life. It is what is most commonly identified with the essential nature of the human person. That is why Samuel, when he is tasked with finding a new king of Israel, and is presented with all the strongest men of the tribe, declares that God has rejected them all. Man looks at the outward appearance, says Samuel, but the Lord looks at the heart. This is why St. Paul teaches, we all come unto a perfect man, unto the measure and fullness of Christ. That you put off concerning the former way of life the old man, which is corrupt, and be renewed in the spirit of your heart. That you put on the new man, which is created in righteousness and true holiness. The reality of grace which we are promised is made flesh in the lives of men through the habits of Christ we take on. But this conforming oneself to Christ is not just the process of sanctification of the individual soul, but rather it is how a Christian culture comes to be formed. It is how the Christian way of life comes through the foundation of Western civilization. For culture should be understood as the habits of a civilization. And the habits of Western civilization are the habits of Christ. Let me explain. I mentioned this idea elsewhere, but culture as process, as the idea of culture as process, but leave you give me the briefest descriptions of what I mean. Every cultural institution is created by the habits of people, and those habits are formed by the essential ideas of that people. Let's use the example of the university. It is one of the greatest institutions of Western civilization, at least it used to be. The origin of this idea of a university is found in Christian revelation. Per quem omnia facta sunt. That is, all things were made through him, means that as we study the things of nature, we are studying the person of Christ. As Newman teaches, as we pursue the truth, we are drawn into a hierarchy of knowledge, not just of the world, but ultimately of God himself. That even if the quantity of things known would multiply, they would all end in knowledge of the one truth, a literal uni versus, towards the one. And thus, as we pursue the habits of studying the world, we created a system, an institution, that would provide such a high level of synthesis of knowledge hence the university. Though I have been brief, too brief perhaps, suffice it to say that it is a working illustration of that process which creates culture. Ideas form habits that create institutions. But the real genius of Western civilization does not simply lie in a few fortuitous ideas. Western civilization is not created by one idea forming one habit that creates one institution. That would be far too simplistic, and I would add demonstrably incomplete. Rather, Western civilization is the result of a complex system of ideas and habits. What is essential is at the heart of Western civilization is the fundamental idea that to be a follower of Christ means to take on the habits of Christ. And these habits are the foundation of Western civilization. But what is it within Christianity that creates and coordinates these ideas and habits into anything approximating something so intricate and complicated as Western civilization? The answer lies in the solution that Christianity offers to its most obvious question. What is Christ's greatest habit? The question of how to imitate Christ can consume the Apostolic Church, and is a question very close to the one the Jewish authorities asked about what was the greatest law in the covenant of Moses. The controversies of the Jewish religion were legal. The first controversies of the early church were moral. How do we become like Christ? These moral questions, of course, would eventually lead to the great Christological controversies of the 4th and 5th centuries. We first asked what it meant to follow Christ, which quickly became a desire to know and understand exactly who Christ was. But into this first century controversy was added a second and equally complicating element. Christ had declared all things clean, as recounted in Mark 7. This idea was clarified to Peter in his dream about Cornelius, centurion in Acts chapter 10, as well as the Council of Jerusalem, recounted in Acts 15. The fundamental religious categories of Judaism are clean and unclean. These categories taught the Jews how to survive in the world of men and also prepare themselves for the world of God. Clean and unclean separated Judaism from everything and everyone else. And then Christ declares all foods are clean, that we must render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and that we too are to go out and make all nations a part of our religion. These ideas were and are still more scandalous to the Jews than Trinitarian theology, because they abolished the Jewish categories of clean and unclean. The incarnation of Christ, however, is not merely a mechanism of our salvation. It is the nature of our salvation, that all flesh would see the salvation of God. It meant that Christians would have nothing to fear from the world, for the world had no power over us. But this left Christians with a very real problem. How were they to distinguish themselves from the world? And how would we ensure our religion did not collapse into the worldly? Christians would have a Christian life in the middle of the world without fearing it. That is why Tertullian will say about the first Christians, we live among the pagans, we dress like them and eat with them. But what distinguishes us from them? For if we were like those around us, what was the religious point of Christianity? One of the great struggles of the early church was where to draw the line between our religion and the world. It is why one of the first impulses of the early church was to monastic life. They were not fleeing from the world because they couldn't quite let go of the Jewish idea of an unclean world. They were showing all Christians the reality of a greater world beyond this one. So how does this new doctrine, with its apparently loosey-goosey approach to religion, prevent itself from collapsing into just a worldly philosophy? But as in all things, the law is a pedagogue, and the Jewish law of clean and unclean will prepare the Christian mind to think in terms of what is like Christ and what is unlike Christ. Jewish ritual purity became a habit that would shape our understanding of Christian holiness. The Jewish fashioning of the Christian mind would ensure that the first disciples would immediately intuit and imitate the principal habit of Christ. Thousands of years of preparation of the people of God mean that Christ's principal habit would be second nature to them. And what is the principal habit of Christ? It is his resistance. Christ resists. Now, this may immediately seem untrue to you, for Christ's first virtue, should be charity. And you would be right, but also incomplete insofar as Western civilization is concerned. For Christ's charity is not a charity like unto this world. It is very much a supernatural charity. Along with all of Christ's virtues, they resist what is worldly. We know that the clash between Jesus and the Jewish authorities plays out in the context of the law. Yet the actual tension that exists between the Jews and Jesus is the tension between this world and his kingdom. The categories of clean and unclean serve the pedagogical purpose of instructing man that there exists a tension between this world of men and the actual law of God. For my kingdom is not of this earth. However, this tension does not underscore the unbridgeable gap between God and men, but to teach us that Christ has overcome it. For Christ, even though he makes clear the distinction between our world and his invitation is to make us a part of his kingdom. There are many rooms in my Father's house, and I go to replace for you. When I argue that the fundamental habit of Christ is resistance, I'm not arguing that it is superior to charity or justice. I am arguing that what makes all of Christ's perfect virtues intelligible to us is his habitual resistance. Resistance is a kind of meta virtue. For Christ to instruct us in virtue, so that we may take on the habits of Christ, is for us to understand that our charity must not be like that of the scribes and Pharisees. Our justice cannot be like the pagans. Our imitation of Christ, all our virtue, must resist what is fallen. Christ teaches us his virtues when he resists James and John, who want to sit at the right and left, when he resists Peter, who thinks he will lay down his life for Christ, or the apostles when they argue amongst them who is the greatest. But Christ's resistance is not simply no, but rather is a no, not that. Rather, embrace this. For there are indeed places at Christ's right and left, and one day Peter will lay down his life. But in order to do so, either of these two things, we must give up first the old man, so the new man may take his place. The resistance of Christ is asking us to give up something lesser, though we embrace something higher, to let go of the unclean so the clean may embrace us. Or, for example, celibacy for the sake of the kingdom. It is precisely because Christ resists that we can begin to make sense of what it means to be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. At the heart of each of Christ's virtues is his resistance of our efforts to collapse his world into our sin, so that we may be one with him, as he and the Father are one. Christ resists because Christ loves. But this resistance would not just be fundamental to the Christian life, but the very reality of the church. Her tradition and the Western civilization she would come to create. The break between Christianity and Judaism was not a minor tiff over some obscure point of theology. The new covenant would affect every area of Christian life and its culture. However, Christianity had to reconcile two conflicting ideas. Firstly, not one iota of the law would be lost, but neither was it the equal of the new. Something in the old had to be resisted, but somehow retained as well. And what remained had to be elevated and purified by what was new. But this required a sophisticated process that needed to be second nature to the church, charged with the duty of elevating and purifying, of keeping and disregarding, of binding and loosing. How Christianity would reconcile the old order and the new covenant will not be by merging the two, for new wine must be placed in new wineskins. Rather, would achieve a perfect balance between them by living according to tradition. Christianity had to ensure that what was new would remain both distinct and superior to the old. But in order for the new to be properly received, it had to be seen in the light of what was old. That is why John the Baptist is the precursor of Christ, and why there is an Old Testament before there could be a new. The old would shed light on the new, not simply because it was new, but because Christ had made all things new. We understand that Christ has made all things new because we live by the light of received wisdom. In the life of the church, this is her tradition. The process of resisting and purifying, of elevating and handing on, is both the tradition of the church and the foundation of Western civilization. The habit that was forming the life of the church was also forming the Christian culture around her. This is not simply a tradition of resistance, but rather the tradition as resistance. Sanctification revolution lies at the heart of the Catholic tradition. This is why the tradition is the foundation of Western civilization. The Church created a culture that lives according to received wisdom, that makes all things new. And at the heart of the tradition is the principal habit of Christ, his resistance. This is why Augustine is free to adapt the logos of Plato to the incarnate Son and Word of God without fear or trembling. It is why Aquinas is unashamed in introducing the Stagirites' form and matter into the body and blood of Christ, and why the Church herself will adopt and elevate Roman law, Greek pedagogy, and Jewish custom. She received, purified, and elevated what she had received, and turned it into new wine. It is why one of the chief Protestant criticisms of Catholicism was that it was a mishmash of Greek philosophy, Roman bureaucracy, and pagan practices, a kind of theological plagiarism. What she is a pantheon of ancient wisdom made new. So where does liberalism fit into this understanding of Western civilization? Lockean liberalism has made arguably the greatest contribution to liberal democracy in the United States, and to a lesser extent Australia. However, the problem at the heart of Locke's liberalism is theological. His philosophical anthropology is a direct consequence of his religion. In the two treaties, Locke makes the claim that man is God's property. Now, since property is the foundational category of his anthropology, Locke necessarily finds himself constrained by the concept of contract, since contract is the most effective mechanism for regulating property. If man is a kind of property, then the public interactions of men must be regulated by terms that are both clear and binding. For property, if it is to be the proper object of contract, requires some kind of value. Nothing can be exchanged by contract that doesn't possess value. Otherwise, the contract would fail for want of consideration. In Locke's thesis, the value of man lies in the rights he possesses, as given him by God Almighty. And since they come from God, they have a foundation independent of the laws of any particular society. They belong to man in his state of nature. In effect, they are the value which God has endowed his property. Thus people, in the state of nature, conditionally transfer some of their rights to the government in order to better ensure peace and stability. The mechanism that persists as a contractual relationship between the government and the governed is trade. Locke understands this system of exchange also gives no direction on how to best decide on which laws, or more specifically, which terms of the contract should bind the parties. He states that if survival is the end, then we must ask, what are the necessary means to that end? On Locke's account, these turn out to be life, liberty, health, and property. Now, since the end is set by God, on Locke's view, we have a right to the means to that end. And this is where Locke introduces his golden rule, interpreted in terms of natural rights. Locke tells us the law of nature is revealed by reason and commands what is best for us. How one determines what is best is by the individual reflecting on what is best for himself. Given that we all share the same goal of survival, the same freedom is given to us by God, this self-reflection will reveal the law common to everyone. It is in this sense that Locke means that reason reveals the law. In terms of our paradigm, the culture of liberalism is based on the idea of self-preservation, which forms a habit of acting in one's own self-interest that creates the institution of the culture of the social contract. And this new cultural paradigm of liberalism, is quite at odds with Western culture as it had been conceived up to the Reformation. Liberalism can be hard to critique against the backdrop of the modern experience. It can be argued that Locke's bare-bones statism allows material freedom as a means to live peaceably in an increasingly heterogeneous society. This is part of the allure of the return to liberalism amongst those who share our concern for the future of Western civilization. But they are very wrong. Liberalism lacks the principle which turns received wisdom into new wine. At the heart of Lockean liberalism lies a fatal flaw. Locke attempts to ground liberty and prosperity in something fleeting and tangible. He ultimately grounds it in the most unpredictable and capricious, the self. Locke has provided us with a certain kind of Cartesian morality. I am, therefore I want. Locke asks us to consider what we need in order to survive. Upon reflection on what I need to survive, I would discover the basis of what everyone else would need to survive as well. Locke's golden rule is not upending the golden rule. The golden rule is about our obligation to others. His golden rule is about others owed to me. Others, loosely defined as the state. Liberalism's ultimate foundation is in the self, and a broken notion of the self at that. For its anthropology requires that the peaceable means of preservation of life, liberty, and property is guaranteed by the institutionalizing the lowest common denominator of human behavior, self-interest. This false anthropology of the self has led to the idealization of freedom, but freedom defined as material voluntarism. All I have to do is want, and all society has to do is to want in its own self-interest, and laws will be made in society formed that will preserve itself. But the basis of society is not the individual. This was as clear to the Greeks and Romans as it was to Christianity. Rather, the basis of society is the virtuous self, more specifically, the person in relation to others, not the person in relation to himself. That is why the family, not the individual, is the proper grounding for the social order. For the family is the first place of interaction. Received wisdom teaches self-control and not self-interest. The principal enemy of virtue is not evil, it's not even vice, it is the self. When the self becomes the point of reference, it is impossible to find the midpoint between two extremes, because all things are judged from an individualistic standpoint, and not from the mean. To put Aquinas' theory of virtue very briefly, virtue is required for the person to act virtuously. That is, even before I decide to act courageously and overcome a particular fear, I must first know what is to be done, prudence. Act from choice and not from mere passion, temperance. Do so for a due end, justice, and act firmly and immovably, fortitude. It is these four cardinal virtues that are the virtues of virtue, more specifically, the form of virtue, that allows us to recognize and choose the mean in each virtuous act. That is why self-control and self-interest is the origin of the person, and thus civic virtue. The virtues of virtues are learned in relationship with others, which occurs primarily in the family, when families are healthy. The problem at the heart of Locke's theory is that it lacks a proper understanding of the goods for the soul, because Locke's proposed goods are material, life, liberty, and property. And since Locke ignores virtue, his philosophy lacks any reference to the higher functions of the soul, thus offers no account of what the goods of society might be beyond the material. That is why Locke describes virtue not as duty but as convenience. The bare essentials of the soul do not provide enough to sustain the flourishing of the higher objects of the soul, good, true, beautiful, even in relation to political theory. And none of the above critique of Locke is particularly new. However, can Catholicism offer any kind of correction to such a doctrine? And secondly, should it even bother? Let me answer the second one first. There are institutions of liberalism that it is wise for Catholicism to preserve, in part because many of these institutions, although closely identified with liberalism, are not entirely products of liberalism. Free markets, free speech, universal suffrage, the rule of law, separation of powers, each have origins that predate liberalism, and although their order is now tainted by the liberal self, they possess certain qualities that make them essential to Western civilization. It would be unwise to abandon them, as it would risk much misery. The corrective that Catholicism offered to liberalism is tradition. Not tradition understood as a content of doctrine, but rather a tradition lived as resistance. But how does a tradition correct liberalism? The Lord's command to Peter, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, is used to explain the separation between church and state. However, this particular teaching is firstly spiritual before it is even political. At the heart of Christ's teaching is that in order to engage with the world, and long before you even try to govern it, you must let go of what does not belong to you. To render unto Caesar is only possible because you have something that is not yours. Yet the Lord is not requiring of our poverty in order to be Prime Minister. That is not practicable. And neither is he asking you to renounce the world before you take your place in it. That is impossible. What you must let go of first is not the world, but the man who is so attached to himself that he can't see anything in the world that does not belong to him. Before you begin to engage in the public order, you must first see clearly that there is something that is not yours that must be rendered. That thing is not an object, it is rather the corrupted self. You must separate yourself from man when he sees the world, sees only himself. Thus the first correction that the tradition offers to liberalism is that of self-government, the idea of resisting oneself. Catholic tradition is resistance, that is, it preserves by renewing. It is thus a living tradition, not as is subverted by some in the Church in order to propose innovations, but a process that distinguishes that which Christ has made new from the worldly, the fallen, and the novel. It is not merely a collection of things, doctrines, practices, or prayers. It is a way of being. Christian is for Christianity what halakha is for the Jews. It is what resists the Gospel of Thomas and proposes the Apocalypse. It is what resists homiousion and insists on homoousion. It is at the heart of every doctrine, practice, and prayer. Every aspect of our faith, scripture, magisterium, and our liturgy resists what is novel or fallen, and will embrace only that which Christ has made new. The cycle of creation, death, and resurrection is the heart of tradition, both in the Church and Western civilization. It is that principle that is the heart of tradition. It resists decay in all its forms. It is why one of the greatest institutions of Western civilization, the common law, can create a legal system founded on the common man, decay into trial by ordeal, and resurrect itself in the jury system. Liberalism, the fruit of Protestantism, which cannot resist what is fallen, because it has rejected the very principle of resistance itself, the tradition. Tradition does not impose an outcome, rather it insists on a certain kind of order. It doesn't replace what is prior with what is officially Catholic. Rather it receives truth, goodness, and beauty, wherever it is to be found, and elevates and purifies it by resisting whatever may be fallen within it. This is how Catholic tradition views all things, even liberalism, by resisting the fallen self and embracing the proper goods of the soul. This correction of liberalism, although I think it is more correct to say the reform of Western institutions infected by liberalism, begins with ideas. Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And the transformation is brought to perfection when habits are recreated, that you may prove what is good and acceptable and perfect, the will of God. Catholic tradition is the habits of Christ, what the cardinal virtues are to virtue itself, the form of those virtues. Tradition does for the habits of Christ what the cardinal virtues do for virtue, to make them intelligible and thus practical to us. Tradition insists on what ideas and in what order habits must be renewed, for the fabric of virtue in Western civilization is weaved from the habits of Christ. But tradition does this, not by positing a theory of the good, but rather by presenting the embodiment of that good, Christ himself. We are sons of God, not his property, and as sons we are heirs to everything that God offers. Thus, we cannot choose to imitate a few of the virtues of Christ that we find popular or convenient. We are to imitate all of him, not just some of him on a whim. That would be to isolate the virtues of Christ one from the other. Charity without justice, truth without mercy. And that, to paraphrase Chesterton, would mean a world where virtue had gone mad and is free to wander wildly and wreak havoc on mankind, which liberalism, in its idolization of self-centered freedom, has done. I have probably left you perplexed as to whether I'm arguing to save liberalism or to chuck it. The same question faced the first Christians, whether they should keep Judaism or abandon it. And the 4th century Christians too had the same questions about the Roman Empire. The answer is, Catholicism does really neither. She keeps what she musts and jettisons what is a burden, according to the tradition she has received from her Lord. Resist what is fallen and embrace what he has made new. There is something demonstrably wrong with the Enlightenment principles that have guided the last several centuries of Western civilization. I think the tumult we are experiencing at present points to this fact. There is something about the West that needs to die and something else that wants to be born. What these two things will be is still largely undecided. This moment affects the culture as much as it does the church. The great intellectual battle of the church at present, and I would add the culture in our day, is over the true nature of tradition. This battle will define this era and the one to come after it. It began in the Reformation, but was rekindled somewhere around the time of the First Vatican Council. This battle is, to us, over the tradition, is what the Christological controversies were to the 4th and 5th centuries. This battle will need to be equally theologically sophisticated, and I would argue, as equally broad as well. For just as the person of Christ touches every aspect of our Catholic faith, so too does the tradition. At present, however, we are at the moment of the Third Council of Smirmium, the year 357. And much like that time of that council, we too have no Athanasius to resist the heretics. Athanasius had been condemned at the Council of Milan and was exiled the year prior. But we need an Athanasius today to do for our understanding of tradition what he did for Christology. When it comes to the present malaise of liberalism and the dissatisfaction that it has caused, we must avoid the temptation of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. In our frustration, do we throw away Parliament and its representatives? Do we overturn the independence of the judiciary or destroy the free market? All because we now think they don't serve our self-interest? If we fail to embrace Christianity's tradition, we will fail in making all things new. Rather, we will just make all things into a mess. As the mostly peaceful riots of the Northern Hemisphere summer of 2020 attest. An uncritical and unvirtuous dissatisfaction with a system will result in the destruction of the bad and the good along with it. The same self-interest that guided the construction of a project, if left unchallenged and uncorrected, will simply perpetuate its evils by proposing an equally bankrupt system. Unchallenged self-interest is what got us into this mess in the first place. Only a tradition that resists can actually restore the West.